guys, welcome back to the Acred Living Room. Frank and I are excited for you to join us today for chapter 17 and 18 of Hatchet. We are almost done with our book and we are just dying to know what's going to happen to Brian. Does he ever get rescued? Okay, so join me on page 150 in your online textbook. If you remember the last time that we met, there had been a tornado that had torn through the camp. And now Brian has his ribs hurt from being attacked from a moose, and his camp is a disarray. So let's see what he does now. Page 150. He turned back to his campsite and looked at the wreckage. He had a lot to do to rebuild his shelter. Get a new fire going, find some food, or get ready to find food. Make weapons, and he had to work slowly because his ribs hurt. First things first. He tried to find some dry grass, some twigs, and then peeled bark from the nearby birch to shred into a fire nest. He worked slowly, but even so, with his new skill, he had a fire going in less than an hour. The flames cut the cool, damp morning and crackled in much to bring his spirits up, not to mention chasing away the incessant mosquitoes. With the fire going, he searched for dry wood. The rain had driven water into virtually all the wood that he could find, and at last he finally located in the thick evergreen were the top branches that had been covered the lower branches and had kept them dry. He had great difficulty breaking them, not being able to pull much with his arm or chest muscles, but finally got enough to keep the fire going all day and into the night. And with that he rested a bit and eased his chest. Then he set about getting his shelter squared away. Much of the wood from his original wall was still nearby, up and in the back of the ridge. He actually found a major section of the weave still intact. The wind had torn it out, lifted it, and thrown it into the top of the ridge, and Brian felt lucky once more that he had not been killed and more seriously injured, which would have been the same, he thought. If he couldn't hunt, he would die, and if he was injured badly, he would not be able to hunt. He jerked and dragged wood around until the wall was once more in place. Crudely, but he could always improve it later. He had no trouble finding enough pine boughs to make a new bed. The storm had torn the forest to pieces up in the back of the ridge. It looked like a giant had become angry and used some kind of massive meat grinder on the trees. Huge pines were twisted and snapped off and blown sideways. The ground was so littered with limbs and the treetops sticking up every which way that it was hard to get through. He pulled enough thick limbs in for a bed, green and spicy with the new broken sap smell. But by evening he was exhausted, hungry, and hurting. But he had something close to a place to live again, a place to be. Tomorrow, he thought as he lay back in the darkness, tomorrow maybe the fish would be back, and he would make a spear and a new bow and get some food. Tomorrow he would find food and refine the camp, and bring things back to sanity from one very incomplete, insane day. He faced the fire, curving his body, and rested his head on his arm and began to sleep, when a picture came to his mind, the tail of the plane sticking out of the water. There it was, the tail sticking up, and inside the plane, near the tail, somewhere was a survival pack. It must have survived the crash, because the plane's main body was still intact. That was the picture, the tail sticking up and the survival pack inside, right there in his mind as he dozed. His eyes snapped open. If I could just get the pack, he thought. Oh, if I could get that pack, it probably had food and knives and matches, and it might even have a sleeping bag. It might have fishing gear. Oh, it must have so many wonderful things. If I could get the pack and I could get those things, I would be rich. So rich if I could get that pack. Tomorrow. He watched the flames and he smiled. Tomorrow I'll see. All things come tomorrow. He slept deep and down with only the picture of the plane sticking up in his mind, a healing sleep. In the morning he rolled out before the true light, and in the gray dawn he brought up the fire and found more wood for the day, feeling almost chipper because his ribs were much better now. With the camp ready for the day, he looked around at the lake. Part of him half expected the plane tail to be gone, to sink back into the depths, but he saw it, that it was still there and it didn't seem to have moved at all. He looked down at his feet and saw that there were some fish in the fish pen looking for tiny bits of bait still left there from the wind came. He fought impatience to get on the plane project and remembered that he had learned. First food, because food made strength. First food and then thought, then action. There were fish at hand here. He might not be able to get anything from the plane. That was all in a dream. The fish were real, though, and his stomach, even his new shrunken stomach, was sending signals that it was savagely empty. He made a fish spear with 2 points, not peeling the bark back all the way, but working on the pointed end. It took him an hour or so, and all the time he worked and he sat, looking at the tail of the plane sticking out of the air. His hands working on the spear, his mind working on the problem of the plane. When the spear was done, although still crude, he jammed a wedge between the points to spread them apart and went to the fish pond. There were not clouds of fish, but at least 10, and he picked one of the larger ones, a round fish almost 6 inches long, and put the spear point in the water, held it, and then thrust with a flicking motion of his wrist, when the fish was just above the point. The fish was pinned neatly, and he had 2 more with the same ease, and then carried all 3 back to the fire. He had a fish hoard now, a new piece of wood he had flattened with a hatchet, and then leaned up by the fire, cooking the fish, so that he didn't have to hold a stick all the time. He put the 3 fish on the board and pushed the sharp pegs through their tails into the cracks of the cooking board, and then propped it up next to the reddest part of the coals. In moments the fish were hissing and cooking with the heat, and as soon as they were done, or when he could stand the smell no longer, he picked the steamy meat from under the loosened skin and ate it. The fish did not fill him, not even close. Fish meat was too light for that. But they gave him strength, and he could feel it moving into his arms and legs, and he began to work on the plane project. While making the spear, he decided that he would have to do was make a raft and push paddle to the raft to the plane and tie it there for a working base. Somehow he would have to get into the tail, inside the plane, and rip or cut his way in, and however he did, it would need an operating base of some kind, a raft, which he found ruefully was much easier said than done. There was plenty of logs around, and the shore was filtered with driftwood, new and old, tossing up and scattered by the tornado. And it was a simple matter of trying to find 4 of them about the same length and pull them together. Keeping them together was the problem. Without a rope or cross pieces, nails or logs just rolled and separated. He tried wedging them together, crossing them over each other, and nothing seemed to work, and all he needed was a stable platform to get the job done. It became very frustrating, and he had momentary loss of temper as he would have done in the past when he was the other person. At one point he sat back on the beach and studied the problem again. Sense. He had to use his sense. That's all he had, and it took to solve problems. Just sense. It came then. The logs he had selected were smooth and round with no limbs, and what he needed were logs that had with limbs sticking out so that he could cross the limbs over one log, over the limbs and another, and kind of weave them together, as he had done with the wall and the food shelf cover and the fish gate. He scanned the area above the beach and found 4 dry treetops that had been broken off by the storm. They had limbs, and he dragged them down to the work area of the water's edge and lifted them together. It took almost the day, and the limbs were cluttered and stuck every which way, and when you have to cut one to make another fit, and then cut another one to come back to the first one, and then still another from the third one would have to be pulled in. But at last in the late afternoon he was done, and the raft, which he called brush pile, won, for it looks hung together. Even as he pulled it into the water off the beach, it floated well. If low in the water, and in the excitement, he started for the plane. He could not stand on it, but he would have to swim alongside. He was almost chest deep when he realized he had no way to keep the raft at the plane. He needed a way to tie it in place so he could work from it. And for a moment, he was stimmed. He had no rope. Only a bowstring, and The other cut shoestring in his tennis shoes, which were by now looking close to dead, his toes showing at the tops. And then he remembered his windbreaker, and he found the tattered part he had used for an arrow pouch. He tore it into narrow strips and tied them together and made a rope to tie down about 4 or 5 feet long. It wasn't strong, and he couldn't use it to pull a Tarzan or swing from a tree, but he could hold the raft to the plane. Once more, he slid the raft off the beach and out into the water until he was chest deep. He had left his tennis shoes in the shelter where he felt the sand turn to mud between his toes and kicked off the bottom and began to swim. Pushing the raft, he figured he was about like trying to push an aircraft carrier. Off all the branches that stuck down into the water dragged and pulled, and the logs then themselves fought any forward motion, and he hadn't gone 20 feet when he realized that it was going to be much harder than he thought to get the raft to the plane. It barely moved, and he kept going this way. He would have just reached the plane at dark. He decided to turn back and spend the night and start early in the morning. He pulled the raft once more into the sand and scraped it dry with his hand. Patience. He was better now, but impatience still ground him a bit, so as he sat at the edge of the fish pond with a new spear, it took 3 more fish and cooked them and ate them, which helped to pass the time until dark. He also dragged in some more wood, endless wood, and then relaxed and watched the sun set over the trees in the back over the ridge. West, he thought. I'm watching the sun set in the west, and that way was north, where his father was, and that way was east, and that south. Somewhere to the south and east as his mother would be. The news would be on the television, and he could visualize more easily his mother doing things than his father because he had never been to where his father lived before. He knew everything about how his mother lived, and she would be on the small television on the kitchen counter and watching the news and talking about how awful it was in South Africa or how cute the baby in the commercial looked, talking and making sounds and cooking sounds. He jerked his mind back to the lake. There was a great beauty here, almost unbelievable beauty. The sun exploded the sky and just blew it up with the setting color, and that the color came down into the water of the lake, hitting the trees. Amazing beauty, and he wished that he could share it with somebody and say, "Look there, over there, and see that?" Even alone, it was beautiful, and he fed the fire to cut out the night chill. There it is again, he thought, that late summer chill into the air, the smell of fall. He went to sleep thinking kind of a reverse question. He did not know if he could ever get out of this, could not see how it might be, but if he did somehow get home and go back to living the way he had lived, would it be just the opposite? Would he be sitting watching television and suddenly thinking about the sunset back on the ridge and wonder how the color looked on the lake? Sleep. In the morning, the chill was more pronounced, and he could see the tiny wisp of vapor from his breath. He blew wood on the fire and blew until it flamed, and then banked the flames to last and went out to the lake. Perhaps because the air was so cool, the water felt warm as he waded in. He made sure the hatchet was still on his belt and the raft still held together, and then set out to pushing the raft and kicking and swimming toward the tail of the plane. As before, it was very hard going. Once an eddy of breeze came up against him, he seemed to be standing still, and by the time he was close enough to the tail to see the rivets of the aluminum, he had pushed and kicked for almost 2 hours. He was nearly exhausted and wished that he had taken some time to get a fish or two to have breakfast. He was also wrinkled as a prune and ready for a break. The tail looked much larger when he got next to it, with a major part of the vertical stabilizer showing and perhaps half of the elevators. Only a short piece of the top of the fuselage. The plane's body toward the tail was out of the water, just a curve of aluminum at first, as he could see no place to tie the raft. Then he pulled himself along the elevators to the end, and there he found a gap that went up by the hinges where he could feed his rope through. With the raft secure, he climbed on top of it and lay on his back for 15 minutes, resting and letting the water warm him. The job, he thought, looked impossible. To have any chance of success, he would have to be strong when he started. Somehow he had to get inside the plane, and all the openings, even the small rear cargo hatch, were underwater. So he couldn't get at them without diving and coming up inside the plane, where he would be trapped. He shuddered at that thought and then remembered what was in the front of the plane down in the bottom of the lake, still strapped to the seat, the body of the pilot. Sitting there in the water, Brian could see him, the big man with his hair waving in the current, his eyes open. Stop, he thought. Stop now. Stop that thinking. He was nearly at the point of swimming back to shore and forgetting the whole thing, but the image of the survival pack kept him. If he could just get out of the plane, or if he could just get into it and pull something out, a candy bar, even that, just a candy bar, it would be worth it. But how could he get inside the plane? He rolled off the raft and pulled himself along the plane. No openings. 3 times he put his face in the water and opened his eyes and looked around. The water was murky, but he could see perhaps 6 feet, and there was no obvious way to get in the plane. He was blocked. Brian worked around the tail of the plane 2 more times, pulling himself along the stabilizer and the elevator, but there simply wasn't a way in. Stupid, he thought. I was stupid to think that I could just come out here and get inside the plane. Nothing is that easy. Nothing out here. Not in this place. Nothing is easy. He slammed his fist against the body of the plane. To complete surprise, the aluminum covering gave easily under his blow. He hit it again, and once more it bent and gave. He found that even when he didn't strike it, just pushed it, it still moved. It was really easy, he thought. Very thin aluminum skin over kind of a skeleton. As if it gave that easy, he might be able to force his way through. The hatchet. He might be able to cut or hack with the hatchet. He reached for his belt and pulled the hatchet out and picked a piece where the aluminum gave to his bush and took an experimental swing at it. The hatchet cut through the aluminum as if it was soft cheese. He couldn't believe it. 3 more hacks and he had a triangular hole at the size of his hand, and he could see 4 cables that he guessed were the control cables going back to the tail, and he hit the skin of the plane with a frenzied series of hacks and made still a larger opening, and he was bending a piece of aluminum away from 2 aluminum braces of some kind when he dropped the hatchet. It went straight down past his legs. He felt it bump in by his foot and then go down into the water, and for a second he couldn't understand what that he had done. For all this time and all the living and fighting, the hatchet had been everything, and he had always worn it. Without the hatchet he had nothing. No fire, no tools, no weapons. He was nothing. The hatchet was and had been him. And he had dropped it. "Arr!" he yelled, and he choked on it, a snarl cry of rage of his own carelessness. The hole in the plane was still too small to use for anything, and now he didn't have a tool. "That was the kind of thing I would have done before," he said to the lake and to the sky and to the trees. "When I came here, I would have done that, but not now. Not now." Yet he had, and he hung to the raft for a moment and felt sorry for himself, for his own stupidity. But as before, the self-pity didn't help, and he knew that he only had one course of action. He had to get the hatchet back. He had to dive and get it back. But how deep was it? In the deep end of the gym pool of the school, he had no trouble getting to the bottom, and that was, he was pretty sure, 11 feet. Here it was impossible to know the exact depth, and the front end of the plane, anchored by the weight of the engine, was obviously on the bottom, but it came back up at an angle, so the water wasn't as deep as the plane was long. He pulled himself out of the water so that his chest could expand and worked 2 deep breaths, and he swirled and dove, pulling his arms and kicking off the raft bottom with his feet. The first thrust took him a good 8 feet, but the visibility was only 5 feet beyond that, and he could not see the bottom yet. He clawed down 6 or 7 feet, the pressure pushing in his ears, and he held his nose and popped them, just as he ran out of breath and headed back up when he saw the bottom, and 4 feet below his dive. He exploded out on the surface, bumping his head onto the side of the elevator, and when he came back up and took air like a whale, pushing the stale air out, he wheezed and taking new in. He would have to go yet deeper yet, and still in search while he was down there. Stupid, he thought once more, cursing himself. Just dumb. He pulled air in again and again, pushing his chest out until he could not possibly get any more capacity, and then he took one more deep, lungeful breath and wheeled and dove again. And this time he made an arrow out of his arms and used his legs to push off the bottom of the raft as he had legs to spring snap and propel him down. As soon as he felt himself slowing a bit, he started kicking back with his arms as his strides like paddles, thrusting with his legs like a frog, and this time he was successful, that he ran into his face into the bottom mud. He shook his head clear to clear his eyes and looked around, and the plane disappeared out and down in front of him. He thought he could see the windows that made him think again of the pilot sitting inside and forced his thoughts from it. But he could see no Hatchet. Bad air triggers were starting to go off in his brain, and he knew he had limited seconds now. But he held for a moment and tried moving out a bit just as he ran out of air, and he knew he was going to have to blow soon. So he saw the handle sticking out of the mud. He made one quick grab, missed, and reached again, and felt his fingers close on the rubber. He clutched it, and one more motion slammed his feet down into the mud and powered himself out. But now his lungs were ready to explode, and he had flashes of color in his brain, explosions of colors, and he would have to take a pull of water, taking it into his lungs just as he opened his mouth to take it in, to pull in the water in the lake. His head blew out the surface and into the light. It was as if a balloon had just exploded. Old air blew out of his nose and mouth, and he pulled new in again and again. He reached for the side of the raft and hung there, just breathing until he could think once more, the hatchet clutched and shining in his right hand. All right, the plane, still the plane. He went back to the hole in the fuselage and began to chop and cut again, peeling the aluminum skin off the pieces. It was slow going because he was careful, very careful with the hatchet, but he hacked and pulled until he had an opening long enough or big enough to put his head and his shoulders in, and took down into the water. It was very dark inside in the fuselage, and he could see nothing, certainly no sign of a survival pack, and there were some small pieces and bits of paper floating on the surface inside the plane. Dirt from the floor of the plane had floated up, but nothing substantial. Well, he thought, did you just expect it to be that easy? So easy that way? Just open her up and get the pack, right? He would have to open it more and more so that he could poke down inside and see what he could find. The survival pack had been a zippered nylon bag, or perhaps canvas of some kind, and he thought it had been red. Or was it gray? Well, it really didn't matter. It must have moved when the plane crashed, and it might be jammed down somewhere underneath something. He started chopping again and cutting the aluminum away in small triangles, putting each one of the raft as he chopped. He could never throw anything away again, he thought, because he might find it useful later. Bits of metal, fish arrows or lures maybe, and then he finally finished again. He had cleaned away a whole side and top of the fuselage that stuck out of the water, had cut into the water as far as he could reach, and found a hole almost as big as he was, except that it was crossed and crisscrossed with aluminum, or it might be steel. He couldn't tell. Braces and formers and cables. It was awful, tangled mess, but after chopping some braces away, there was room for him to wiggle through and get inside. He held back for a moment, uncomfortable with the thought of getting inside the plane. What if the raft settled back into the bottom and he got caught and couldn't get out? It was a horrible thought. But then he reconsidered. The thing that had been up for 2 days, plus a bit, and he had been hammering and climbing on it, hadn't gone back down. It seemed pretty solid. He eeled in through the cables and formers, wiggling and pulling until he was inside the tail, with his head clear at the surface of the water and his legs down, angled to the floor. When he was ready, he took a deep breath and pushed down along the floor with his legs, feeling for some kind of fabric or cloth or anything with his bare feet. He touched nothing but floor plates. Up a new breath when he reached down to the formers underwater, pulled himself beneath the water, his legs pushing down almost to the backs of the front seats, and finally, on the left side of the plane, he thought his foot hit cloth or canvas. Up for more air and deep breathing, and then one more grab